Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a place where pain doesn't exist, where everyone you've ever loved waits for you, where eternity feels like the perfect summer afternoon that never ends. Now open them. Does that place exist, or is it the most beautiful lie ever told? Today we're going to explore one of humanity's oldest questions, and the answer might surprise you. Welcome to Logic Over Spirit. I'm your host, and today we're tackling perhaps the most profound question in human existence. Is heaven real? This isn't just a question for the religious or the faithful. It's a question that touches every single person who has ever lost someone they love. Everyone who has ever wondered what happens when we take our final breath. And everyone who has ever looked up at the stars and asked if there's something more. For thousands of years, billions of people have lived their entire lives believing in heaven. They've made sacrifices, followed strict moral codes, and found comfort in the promise of eternal paradise. Wars have been fought over it. Cathedrals have been built for it. Families have been torn apart and brought together by it. But in an age of science, logic, and empirical evidence, can we still justify this belief? Or is heaven simply humanity's greatest coping mechanism, a psychological construct we created to deal with the terror of our own mortality? Today, we're going to examine this question from three critical perspectives. We'll look at what science tells us about consciousness, death, and the possibility of an afterlife. We'll explore what major world religions teach about heaven and why these beliefs emerged. And we'll dive into the philosophical arguments that have challenged and defended the concept of heaven for centuries. We won't be taking sides. We won't be preaching. We're simply going to follow the evidence, the logic, and the reasoning wherever it leads us. Because whether you're a devout believer, a skeptical atheist, or somewhere in between, this question matters. It shapes how we live, how we treat others, and how we face our final moments. So let's begin this journey together. Let's ask the hard questions. Let's challenge our assumptions. And let's discover what we can really know about heaven. Chapter 1. The Universal Longing. Before we can ask if heaven is real, we need to understand why the concept exists in the first place. And here's something fascinating. Nearly every culture in human history, separated by vast oceans and thousands of years, independently developed some concept of an afterlife paradise. The ancient Egyptians had the Field of Reeds, a perfect mirror of Egypt where the worthy dead would live forever in peace. The Norse imagined Valhalla, a great hall where warriors would feast and fight for eternity. Hindus speak of Moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth and union with the divine. Muslims describe Jannah, gardens of paradise flowing with rivers of milk and honey. Christians envision the kingdom of heaven, where believers will live in God's presence forever. These aren't just similar ideas. They're remarkably consistent in their core elements: a place of eternal happiness, freedom from pain and suffering, reunion with lost loved ones, reward for moral behavior in life. This consistency across cultures is striking, and it demands an explanation. Psychologist Carl Jung wrote, "The dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul." He believed that certain ideas, certain archetypes, exist in what he called the collective unconscious, universal patterns of thought that appear across all human cultures. Could heaven be one of these archetypes? A fundamental human concept that emerges naturally from our consciousness? Or is there a simpler explanation? Perhaps heaven exists in every culture because every culture faces the same fundamental problem: death. And not just death, but the awareness of death. We are, as far as we know, the only species on Earth that knows it will die. We watch our loved ones disappear forever. We feel the clock ticking on our own existence, and this knowledge creates an existential terror that demands resolution. Terror management theory, developed by psychologists in the 1980s, suggests that much of human behavior is driven by our fear of death. We create cultures, religions, and belief systems partly to protect ourselves from this anxiety. From this perspective, Heaven isn't just comforting. It's psychologically necessary. It's the ultimate security blanket against the void. But here's where it gets interesting. Does the psychological need for heaven make it less real, or does it suggest something deeper? After all, we have psychological needs for food, water, and oxygen, and all of those things exist. Maybe our longing for heaven points to something genuine, something we're meant to find. The philosopher Blaise Pascal put it this way: "What else does this craving and this helplessness proclaim but that there was once in man a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace? This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there, the help he cannot find in those that are, though none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God himself." So we're left with a question within a question. Does the universality of heaven beliefs suggest it's a real place our souls somehow know about? Or does it simply prove that all humans share the same fears and the same desperate need for comfort? Chapter 2. What Science Says About Consciousness and Death. Now let's turn to science. If heaven exists, it requires something that survives death. Traditionally, we call this the soul. But does science have any evidence for a consciousness that exists independently of the brain? Here's what we know for certain. Every thought you have, every memory you cherish, every emotion you feel corresponds to physical activity in your brain. We can watch it happen in real time using functional MRI machines. When you remember your childhood, specific neurons fire in your hippocampus. When you feel love, dopamine and oxytocin flood your neural pathways. When you make a decision, activity cascades through your prefrontal cortex. Damage the brain, and you damage consciousness. A stroke can erase language. A tumor can change personality. Alzheimer's disease can slowly delete a person's entire sense of self. If consciousness is just brain activity, then when the brain dies, consciousness dies with it. Game over. No heaven. No afterlife. Just eternal unconsciousness. This is the materialist position, and it's held by most neuroscientists today. Francis Crick, who co-discovered the structure of DNA, put it bluntly: "You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." But not everyone agrees. Some researchers point to phenomena that seem to challenge pure materialism. Near-death experiences, or NDEs, have been reported by millions of people worldwide. These experiences often include remarkably similar elements: moving through a tunnel, seeing a bright light, feeling overwhelming peace, meeting deceased relatives, and most intriguingly, observing events from outside one's own body. Dr. Sam Parnia, a critical care physician who has studied cardiac arrest for decades, documented cases where patients accurately described specific events that occurred while they had no heartbeat, no breathing, and no brain activity. In one famous case, a patient described a shoe on a hospital ledge that no one could have seen from her position. The shoe was later found exactly as described. Skeptics argue that these experiences are simply the brain's last gasps, hallucinations created by oxygen deprivation, or the flood of neurochemicals that accompanies death. And there's evidence for this. We can artificially induce NDE-like experiences by stimulating certain brain regions or by administering drugs like ketamine. If these experiences can be manufactured, they argue, then they're clearly just brain states, not evidence of an afterlife. But here's the problem with that dismissal. Just because we can artificially create an experience doesn't mean the natural version isn't real. We can create the sensation of touch by electrically stimulating neurons, but that doesn't mean actual physical touch is an illusion. Maybe NDEs are what happens when consciousness begins to separate from the body. Maybe the brain chemistry we observe is the biological side of a transition we don't fully understand. Quantum physics has opened up new questions about consciousness that were unthinkable a century ago. Some physicists, like Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, propose that consciousness arises from quantum processes in the brain's microtubules. If true, this could mean consciousness operates partially outside classical physics, potentially allowing it to exist in ways we don't yet understand. Others point to the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. The act of observation appears to affect reality at the quantum level. This has led some scientists to propose that consciousness is fundamental to the universe, not just an emergent property of complex brains. If consciousness is woven into the fabric of reality itself, then perhaps it doesn't die when our bodies do. But we have to be honest here. These ideas are speculative. They're not mainstream science, and there's a reason for that. We have no repeatable, testable evidence that consciousness can exist without a physical brain. Every verified study attempting to prove otherwise has failed. If souls exist, they leave no measurable trace. They have no weight, no energy signature, no detectable presence whatsoever. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, as the saying goes. But after centuries of looking, the silence is deafening. Science may not be able to prove heaven doesn't exist, but it certainly can't provide any evidence that it does. Chapter 3. The Religious Case for Heaven. Now let's examine what the world's major religions actually teach about heaven and why billions of people find these teachings convincing. Christianity offers perhaps the most detailed description of heaven in Western thought. The Bible describes it as a place of eternal joy in God's presence, where there's no more death, sorrow, crying, or pain. The book of Revelation paints an image of a new Jerusalem with streets of gold, gates of pearl, and the tree of life. But more than the physical descriptions, Christian heaven is about the relationship with God and restoration of what was lost in the Garden of Eden. Jesus spoke about heaven frequently, describing it as a place he was going to prepare for his followers. He said, "In my Father's house there are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I am going to prepare a place for you?" For Christians, heaven isn't earned through good works alone. It's a gift of grace, accessed through faith in Christ. But here's something many people don't realize. Christian concepts of heaven have evolved significantly over 2,000 years. Early Christians expected Jesus to return imminently and establish a physical kingdom on earth. The idea of souls immediately going to a spiritual heaven after death was influenced heavily by Greek philosophy, particularly Plato's belief in an immortal soul that escapes the prison of the body. Islam's vision of heaven, Jannah, is described in vivid sensory detail in the Quran. It's a garden paradise with rivers flowing beneath, where believers will recline on couches, wear silk and gold, and enjoy perfect companions. The Quran states, "Indeed, the righteous will be in pleasure, on adorned couches, observing. You will recognize in their faces the radiance of pleasure." In Islamic thought, heaven is earned through faith in Allah and living according to His commands. Good deeds are weighed against bad deeds on the Day of Judgment. But like Christianity, Islam also emphasizes God's mercy and grace. The Prophet Muhammad reportedly said, "None of you will enter paradise because of his deeds alone." When asked, "Not even you, O Messenger of Allah?" he replied, "Not even me, unless Allah covers me with His mercy." Eastern religions offer different perspectives. In Hinduism and Buddhism, the goal isn't eternal existence in a paradise, but liberation from existence itself. Moksha and Nirvana represent freedom from the endless cycle of death and rebirth. Suffering, according to these traditions, comes from attachment and desire. True happiness comes from transcending the self entirely. The Buddha taught, just as a chariot is known by the name chariot because of the presence of its parts, so is the living being known because of the presence of the five aggregates. In other words, the self is an illusion. There's no permanent soul to go to heaven. Realizing this truth brings liberation. So which religion is right? They can't all be correct in their specifics. Christian heaven, Islamic Jannah, and Buddhist Nirvana are fundamentally different concepts. This contradiction troubles many seekers. If God or ultimate truth exists, why would it reveal itself so differently to different cultures? Religious believers offer several responses. Some argue that their religion is correct and all others are mistaken. Others suggest that different religions represent different paths up the same mountain, each valid for its culture and context. Still others propose that God reveals truth progressively, suited to humanity's evolving understanding. But skeptics see these contradictions as evidence against all religious claims. If heaven were real, they argue, we'd expect consistent reports from across cultures, like we have for physical phenomena like gravity or the sun. The fact that heaven looks different to Christians, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists suggests it's a cultural invention, not a universal truth. Here's another challenge for religious views of heaven. Most require belief in specific doctrines or adherence to particular rules. But what about the billions of people who never heard these teachings? What about the virtuous Buddhist who never encountered Christianity? The kind-hearted atheist who lived morally but rejected religion? Do they forfeit heaven simply for being born in the wrong place or time? Some religious thinkers have grappled with this seriously. C.S. Lewis, in his book The Last Battle, suggested that those who sought truth and goodness were seeking God, even if they didn't call him by that name. Others believe in purgatory or second chances after death, but these ideas often conflict with traditional doctrine. The religious case for heaven ultimately rests on faith, on trust in revealed truth that cannot be verified through ordinary means. And for billions of people throughout history, this faith has been enough. They've felt the presence of the divine. They've experienced transformation through their beliefs. They've witnessed what they believe are miracles. For them, heaven is as real as anything they can touch. But faith alone cannot settle the question for those who remain unconvinced. And that brings us to philosophy. Chapter 4. The Problem of Justice and Moral Order. One of the strongest philosophical arguments for heaven doesn't rely on religious revelation or personal experience. It relies on justice. And it goes like this. This world is manifestly unjust. Good people suffer while evil people prosper. Children die of cancer while dictators live to old age. If there's no afterlife where these wrongs are corrected, then the universe is fundamentally immoral. And if the universe is fundamentally immoral, then moral truths don't really exist. But we know moral truths do exist. Therefore, there must be an afterlife where justice is served. This argument has convinced many thoughtful people throughout history. Immanuel Kant, one of philosophy's greatest minds, argued that morality requires three postulates that cannot be proven but must be assumed: free will, God, and immortality. Without an afterlife, he reasoned, there's no guarantee that virtue will be rewarded or vice punished. And without that guarantee, morality becomes arbitrary. Think about the Holocaust. 6 million Jews murdered for no reason other than hatred. Where is the justice in that? Where is the balance? If there's no heaven for the victims and no hell for the perpetrators, then the universe is simply indifferent to the most extreme evil humans can commit. Many find this conclusion unbearable. Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote in The Brothers Karamazov about a mother whose young child was torn apart by dogs for the amusement of a nobleman. He asked, what could possibly justify such suffering? What future harmony could make it acceptable? His character Ivan concludes that if there's no immortality, no final justice, then everything is permitted. Morality itself becomes meaningless. But this argument has serious weaknesses. First, it's wishful thinking disguised as logic. Just because we want the universe to be just doesn't mean it is. Reality doesn't conform to our preferences. As Bertrand Russell wrote, no one can sit at the bedside of a dying child and believe in the power and goodness of God. Second, it assumes that injustice demands cosmic correction. But why? Perhaps life is simply unfair, and we need to create justice ourselves through our laws, societies, and actions. Perhaps the challenge of living in an unjust universe is what gives our moral choices meaning. If everyone eventually gets what they deserve in heaven, then our earthly struggles for justice become less urgent. Third, this argument proves too much. If we're inventing an afterlife to solve the problem of justice, why stop at heaven? Why not also invent time travel to prevent injustices before they happen? Why not magic powers to protect the innocent? We can't bring things into existence just because they would solve problems we find troubling. However, there's a deeper version of this argument that's harder to dismiss. It doesn't just claim that injustice proves heaven exists. It claims that our very recognition of injustice points to something transcendent. When we say that the Holocaust was objectively wrong, not just distasteful to us personally, we're appealing to a moral standard that exists beyond human opinion. Where does that standard come from? If we're just evolved apes, products of random mutations and natural selection, why should we trust our moral intuitions? Evolution shaped us to survive and reproduce, not to perceive cosmic truths. Yet we can't help believing that some things are genuinely right and others genuinely wrong. This suggests, some philosophers argue, that we have access to moral truths that transcend the physical world. And if transcendent moral truths exist, then perhaps transcendent moral reality exists, a reality where justice is ultimately served. In other words, heaven. But even if we accept that objective morality exists, it doesn't necessarily require an afterlife. Maybe moral truths are simply facts about what causes flourishing and suffering. Maybe they're logical necessities that follow from the nature of conscious experience. We don't need heaven to ground morality any more than we need heaven to ground mathematics. The question of justice and heaven remains unresolved, but it forces us to confront a profound question. Is this life all there is? And if so, how do we live with that answer? Chapter 5. The Problem of Personal Identity. Here's a philosophical puzzle that challenges the very concept of heaven. What exactly survives death to enter paradise? Your body certainly doesn't, at least not in any recognizable form. So it must be your consciousness, yourself, your identity. But what is that exactly? Consider this. Every cell in your body is replaced over time. The atoms that make up your brain today weren't there 7 years ago. If you lose a limb, you're still you. If you develop dementia, your personality and memories change dramatically, yet most would say you still exist. So what is the essential you that continues? Philosophers call this the problem of personal identity, and it's been debated for thousands of years. John Locke argued that personal identity consists of continuity of consciousness and memory. You're the same person you were yesterday because you remember being that person, and your consciousness flows unbroken from then to now. But this creates problems for heaven. What if you develop Alzheimer's and forget your entire life? Which version of you goes to heaven? The young, healthy version, or the elderly, confused version? What about people who suffer traumatic brain injuries that completely change their personality? What about stillborn infants who never developed consciousness at all? Some religious traditions solve this by saying God restores you to your ideal state. But this raises more questions. If God can edit your personality and memories to create an ideal version of you, is that still you? Or is it a copy, a reconstruction? And if heaven involves becoming sinless and perfect, won't that eliminate everything that made you distinctly you, including your quirks, your struggles, your unique perspective shaped by your specific experiences? There's also the problem of relationships. Many people find comfort in the belief that they'll reunite with loved ones in heaven. But which loved ones? If you were married multiple times, which spouse will you be with in eternity? What about people who remarried after being widowed? Jesus addressed this directly when challenged by the Sadducees, saying that in heaven, people neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels. But if earthly relationships don't continue, what exactly are we reuniting for? The problem gets even stranger when we consider modern neuroscience. Your personality, your memories, your very sense of self can be altered by drugs, electrical stimulation, or brain damage. This suggests that consciousness is deeply dependent on physical brain states. Without your brain, what's left to have experiences in heaven? Some philosophers, like Daniel Dennett, argue that the self is an illusion, a story the brain tells itself to create coherence from the chaos of sensory input and competing neural processes. From this view, there's no permanent soul to survive death because there was never a unified self to begin with. You're more like a committee than a monarch, a collection of processes without a central executive. If this is true, then the question, is heaven real, becomes meaningless. It's like asking if a fictional character can visit a real place. There's no you to go to heaven. But this view seems to deny something fundamental about human experience. You are reading these words right now. You have a subjective experience of being someone. Even if that self is constructed, the construction exists. The experience is real, even if its nature is more fluid than we intuitively believe. Perhaps the question isn't whether the self can survive death, but whether survival means what we think it means. Maybe consciousness doesn't require continuity. Maybe it's like a wave that dissipates, but whose energy continues in new forms. Maybe the boundaries between individual selves are less solid than we imagine, and death is simply a transition from individual consciousness to something more universal. Or maybe, just maybe, there is something irreducible about personal consciousness, something that cannot be explained by neural activity alone, something that could, theoretically, continue after the brain ceases to function. But if that something exists, we have yet to find any scientific evidence for it. Chapter 6. The Argument from Desire. C.S. Lewis proposed an argument for heaven that many find compelling. He wrote, "Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world." This is called the argument from desire, and it touches something deep in human experience. Haven't we all felt it? That sense that we're meant for something more? That longing for a home we've never seen? That intuition that the world as it is isn't the world as it should be? Lewis isn't talking about simple desires like wanting a new car or wishing for vacation. He's talking about what the Germans call Sehnsucht, an inconsolable longing, a bittersweet yearning for something undefined. It's the feeling you get watching a sunset, listening to beautiful music, or holding someone you love, a feeling that this is pointing to something beyond itself, something we're homesick for without knowing what home is. Religious believers often interpret this feeling as the soul's memory of heaven, or its longing for God. St. Augustine famously wrote, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." The restlessness, the dissatisfaction, the persistent feeling that something is missing, these are seen as evidence that we're meant for something this world cannot provide. But skeptics offer a different explanation. This longing might simply be a side effect of human consciousness. We're the only animals capable of imagining better circumstances than our current ones. This ability has huge survival advantages. It drives us to improve our situation, to innovate, to strive. But it also means we're never fully satisfied. We always imagine something better, something more. From this perspective, the longing Lewis describes isn't evidence of heaven. It's evidence of how our minds work. It's the gap between our imagination and reality. And that gap will always exist, no matter how good our circumstances become. Heaven is just the ultimate expression of this gap, the ultimate fantasy of a satisfaction that can never be reached because the longing itself is part of being human. There's also a logical problem with the argument. Lewis claims that every natural desire has a real object. Hunger points to food, thirst points to water. But is this really true? What about the desire for superpowers? Children naturally want to fly like birds, but humans can't actually fly. What about the desire for immortality itself? Just because we want to live forever doesn't mean we can or should. Natural selection can create desires that don't correspond to reality. It just needs those desires to increase reproductive success. If believing in an afterlife made our ancestors more likely to take risks, form larger cooperative groups, or invest in their descendants' future, then evolution would favor the capacity for this belief regardless of whether heaven actually exists. Moreover, not everyone feels this longing. Many people report feeling completely satisfied with earthly existence. They don't sense anything missing. They don't yearn for heaven. Does this mean they're spiritually deficient? Or does it suggest that the longing is cultural or psychological rather than universal? Yet there's something to Lewis's argument that can't be easily dismissed. The fact that we can conceive of perfect justice, perfect beauty, perfect love suggests that these ideals exist in some meaningful sense. We measure reality against them and find it lacking. But if these ideals are just inventions of our minds, why do they have such power over us? Why do they feel more real than the imperfect versions we actually experience? Plato believed that earthly things are shadows of perfect forms that exist in a realm beyond the physical. When we see a beautiful sunset, we're glimpsing a reflection of beauty itself. When we recognize injustice, we perceive the gap between reality and justice itself. Maybe heaven is the realm where these perfect forms exist, where the ideals we can only imagine become actual. Or maybe, as the existentialists would argue, we create meaning and value through our choices and commitments. The longing for heaven is really a longing to escape the responsibility of creating our own meaning. It's easier to believe perfection exists somewhere else than to accept that we must forge whatever meaning and goodness exist right here in this imperfect world. Chapter 7. What if heaven is real but not what we expect? Let's consider a possibility that might challenge both believers and skeptics. What if heaven exists, but it's nothing like what religions describe? What if it's not a place of eternal happiness, but something stranger, something we can't fully imagine from our limited human perspective? Some philosophers and theologians have suggested this. They point out that human language and concepts are inherently limited. We can only describe things in terms of our experience. When we say heaven is paradise, we're projecting earthly pleasures onto eternity. When we imagine reunion with loved ones, we're assuming relationships work the same way after death. But what if reality after death is so radically different that our descriptions are like a child's drawing compared to reality? The mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote about the infinite. He said, "The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me. What if eternity is not the comforting thing we imagine, but something overwhelming and alien? What if consciousness without a body is an experience we cannot begin to fathom? What if meeting the infinite, encountering ultimate reality, is nothing like meeting a loving father figure? Some near-death experiencers report not comfort, but terror. Not peaceful gardens, but incomprehensible visions. Some describe a sense of ego dissolution that felt like dying a second death. What if the most accurate reports are not the comforting ones, but these more disturbing accounts? There's also the possibility that consciousness after death is not eternal in the way we imagine. The physicist Frank Tipler proposed that an advanced future civilization might resurrect everyone who ever lived in a computer simulation at the end of time. From the perspective of those resurrected, this would be indistinguishable from heaven. They wouldn't know billions of years had passed or that they existed as software. But it wouldn't be supernatural. It would be the ultimate expression of technology and compassion. Or consider the quantum immortality hypothesis. If the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is correct, then every possible outcome of every quantum event occurs in some branch of reality. This means that in some branches, you never die. Your consciousness always continues in a universe where you survived. From your subjective perspective, you'd experience one improbable survival after another. Is this a kind of immortality, a kind of heaven? Some philosophers have proposed that time might not work the way we think. If Einstein was right, and past, present, and future all exist equally, then in some sense, you always exist. Every moment of your life is eternally real, frozen in the space-time continuum. Death doesn't erase you, it just marks the boundary of your existence through time. Is this a kind of eternity? Eastern philosophies offer another perspective. What if individual consciousness is an illusion, and what we call the soul is actually a temporary manifestation of universal consciousness? After death, the illusion dissolves and we return to the source, like waves returning to the ocean. We don't go to heaven as individuals. We realize we were never separate from the infinite to begin with. Is this heaven? Or is it the opposite, the annihilation of the self? The writer Jorge Luis Borges explored the horror of certain versions of heaven in his stories. What if heaven lasts forever? Literally forever. What if you've experienced every possible experience, had every possible conversation, exhausted every form of pleasure and knowledge? What happens after the first trillion years? The first Googleplex of years? Eternity without end might be the most terrifying concept imaginable. Even heaven could become hell given enough time. Maybe this is why some religious traditions emphasize transformation in the afterlife. You won't experience heaven as you are now. You'll be changed into something capable of eternal joy without boredom. But again, if you're changed that radically, are you still you? These speculations might seem like mental gymnastics, but they serve a purpose. They remind us that our intuitions about life, death, and eternity are shaped by our limited perspective. We've never been dead. We've never experienced anything outside of time and space. We're trying to understand something completely outside our reference frame. This doesn't mean heaven is real, but it does mean that the question is more complex than a simple yes or no. Reality has surprised us before. Quantum mechanics, relativity, the size of the universe, all of these scientific discoveries reveal that reality is stranger than we imagined. Maybe death is too. Chapter 8. Living with Uncertainty. We've examined the evidence, the arguments, the beliefs. We've looked at what science knows about consciousness. We've explored what religions teach about the afterlife. We've wrestled with philosophical questions about identity, justice, and desire. And after all of this, what can we conclude? The honest answer is that we don't know. We cannot prove heaven exists. We cannot prove it doesn't exist. This uncertainty might frustrate you. We live in an age that values certainty, evidence, and definitive answers. But some questions might not have answers we can access from our current position. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote, "Death is not an event in life. We do not live to experience death." He meant that death, by definition, is something we cannot know empirically. It's the end of experience, or the beginning of something we have no framework to understand. Either way, it's epistemologically inaccessible. This leaves us with a choice. We can choose to believe based on faith, religious teaching, personal experience, or intuition. Billions of people make this choice and find meaning, comfort, and purpose in it. Their belief in heaven shapes their ethics, their priorities, and their ability to face mortality with courage. Who are we to say they're wrong when we cannot prove they are? Or we can choose skepticism. We can insist on living only according to what can be verified and tested. We can accept that death might be the end and find meaning in the finite time we have. We can create purpose without the promise of eternity. Many people make this choice and live rich, moral, fulfilled lives. Who are we to say they're missing something essential? Or we can choose to remain uncertain, to hold the question open. We can acknowledge that we don't know while remaining curious, willing to revise our views as we learn and grow. This might seem like fence-sitting, but it's actually the most intellectually honest position. It takes courage to say, I don't know about something so important. Here's what we can say with confidence. The question matters. Whether heaven exists or not, how we answer shapes everything. It shapes how we treat others. It shapes what risks we take and what sacrifices we make. It shapes how we face suffering and how we approach our final moments. If heaven is real, then this life is a brief prelude to eternity. Our choices here have infinite consequences. Morality is grounded in cosmic truth. Death is not an ending, but a transition. Suffering has meaning as a test or refinement. And we will see our loved ones again. If heaven is not real, then this life is all we have. Our choices matter because they affect the only existence we'll ever know. Morality is grounded in reducing suffering and increasing flourishing here and now. Death is a final ending, which makes every moment precious. Suffering is meaningless, except for the meaning we create from it. And when we lose someone, they're gone forever. These are radically different worldviews, and both can be held with integrity. The believer can point to experiences, intuitions, and philosophical arguments. The skeptic can point to the lack of empirical evidence and the psychological explanations for belief. Neither can prove the other wrong, but perhaps that's okay. Perhaps the uncertainty itself serves a purpose. If we knew for certain that heaven was real, would we value this life as much? Would we work as hard to create justice and reduce suffering if we knew a perfect world awaited? If we knew for certain that death was the absolute end, would we have the courage to face it? Would we risk our lives for others or for principles? The philosopher William James proposed that some questions cannot be decided by evidence alone, and that in such cases, we have the right to choose what to believe based on what leads to the best life. He called this the will to believe. It's not about believing whatever makes you feel good. It's about recognizing that when evidence is genuinely insufficient, we must choose based on other considerations. So ask yourself, what helps you live the best life? What helps you treat others with compassion? What helps you face suffering with courage? What helps you confront mortality with dignity? Maybe the answer to these questions is more important than the factual answer to whether heaven exists. Conclusion. We've journeyed through science, religion, and philosophy. We've examined arguments for and against heaven's existence. We've confronted difficult questions about consciousness, identity, justice, and meaning. And we've arrived not at certainty, but at something perhaps more valuable: understanding. Understanding that this question is complex, nuanced, and deeply personal. Understanding that intelligent, thoughtful people have reached different conclusions. Understanding how we answer shapes who we become and how we live. So, is heaven real? After examining all the evidence, all the arguments, all the perspectives, here's what I can tell you with confidence. Science cannot prove heaven exists. The materialist explanation of consciousness is compelling and supported by overwhelming evidence. When the brain dies, everything we know about neuroscience suggests that consciousness dies with it. Near-death experiences, while fascinating, can be explained by brain chemistry. Quantum theories of consciousness remain speculative. The burden of proof lies with those claiming something survives death, and that burden has not been met. But science also cannot prove heaven doesn't exist. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We don't fully understand consciousness. We don't know why subjective experience exists at all. The hard problem of consciousness, why there is something it is like to be you, remains unsolved. Reality has surprised us before with quantum mechanics, dark energy, and the expansion of the universe. Perhaps it will surprise us again. Religion offers ancient wisdom and billions of testimonies. The consistency of afterlife beliefs across cultures is remarkable. The transformative power of faith is undeniable. Many people report experiences that convince them of heaven's reality, but religions contradict each other on specifics. Faith is not evidence. Personal experience is not scientific proof, and the psychological explanations for belief are compelling. Philosophy raises profound questions without definitive answers. The problem of justice suggests the universe should include an afterlife, but wanting something doesn't make it real. The argument from desire resonates emotionally but has logical weaknesses. The problem of personal identity challenges the very concept of a soul going to heaven. Yet our capacity to conceive of perfection, to recognize transcendent truth, hints at something beyond the physical. If we're being rigorously honest, we must conclude that we simply don't know. We don't know if heaven is real. We don't know what happens when we die. We don't know if consciousness continues. And that's okay. That's human. That's the condition of being finite creatures asking infinite questions. But here's what we do know. We know we're alive right now. We know we share this planet with other conscious beings. We know that suffering is real and kindness matters. We know that love transforms us and connections give life meaning. We know that we will die and that those we love will die. And we know that how we face these truths shapes the quality of our existence. Whether heaven exists or not, we can choose to live as if this moment matters. We can treat others with compassion not because we'll be rewarded in paradise, but because compassion is its own reward. We can pursue justice not because cosmic scales will be balanced, but because justice makes this world better. We can face death with courage not because we're certain of what comes next, but because courage gives dignity to our final act. The atheist philosopher Albert Camus wrote about the myth of Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity only to watch it roll back down. Camus concluded, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Even in apparent meaninglessness, even facing absurdity, we can choose meaning. We can choose happiness. We can choose to make our brief existence matter. And for those who believe in heaven, the uncertainty can be a gift. It makes faith meaningful. It makes trust in the divine genuine rather than calculated. It allows this life to be lived fully rather than merely endured as a waiting room for eternity." As the theologian Karl Rahner wrote, "The believer will repeatedly tell himself he knows nothing about this ultimate mystery of his existence. But despite this, he will cling to the fact that this mystery exists, and that it is the mystery that bestows itself in forgiving love." Perhaps the real question isn't whether heaven is real. Perhaps the real question is, how will you live in the face of uncertainty? Will you choose hope or despair? Will you choose connection or isolation? Will you choose courage or fear? Will you choose love? These choices are available to you regardless of what happens after death. They are the heaven or hell you create right now in this life with every decision you make. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers, which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. Maybe that's the wisest approach. Live the question. Don't rush to certainty when honesty requires doubt. Don't pretend to know what you don't know, but don't let uncertainty paralyze you either. Live fully, love deeply, question boldly, create meaning, seek truth, practice compassion, face mortality with open eyes. Because whether heaven is real or not, this moment is real, this life is real. And that's enough to demand our full attention, our deepest commitment, our greatest courage. Is heaven real? I don't know. But I know this life is real. And perhaps that's where we should place our focus. Not on a destination we cannot verify, but on a journey we are definitely taking. Not on a promised paradise, but on the paradise we can create right here through justice, kindness, beauty, and love. The question will remain open. The mystery will persist. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. Some questions are meant to transform us through the asking rather than satisfy us with answers. Some truths are meant to be lived rather than solved. So live your truth, seek your answers, hold your beliefs with conviction, but also with humility. Listen to those who disagree. Question everything, including your own certainty. And remember that the greatest tragedy isn't dying without knowing if heaven is real. The greatest tragedy is living without ever truly being alive. That's the conclusion I offer you today, not an answer, but an invitation. An invitation to engage with the mystery. An invitation to take the question seriously without letting it consume you. An invitation to live richly in the midst of uncertainty. Because in the end, that might be the only heaven that's guaranteed, the one we create together, here and now, through choices that affirm life, dignify existence, and kindle light in the darkness. Thank you for taking this journey with me today. This is Logic over Spirit, where we don't shy away from the hardest questions. We don't offer easy answers or comfortable certainties. We follow the evidence and the reasoning wherever it leads, even into mystery. If this video made you think, if it challenged your assumptions, if it gave you a new perspective on an ancient question, then please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future episodes where we tackle the big questions with honesty and intellectual rigor. Leave a comment below and tell me, what do you believe about heaven? Has your view changed over time? How does your answer to this question affect how you live? I want to hear from believers, skeptics, and everyone in between. Let's have a real conversation, a respectful dialogue where we can disagree without being disagreeable. Share this video with someone who wrestles with these questions. Share it with believers who want to understand skeptical perspectives. Share it with skeptics who want to understand religious perspectives. Share it with anyone who values thinking deeply about what matters most. And if you want to support the creation of more content like this, consider becoming a patron. Your support allows me to dedicate time to research, writing, and producing these in-depth explorations of life's biggest questions. Remember, we might not all agree on whether heaven is real, but we can all agree that truth matters, that questions matter, and that thinking carefully about our existence is time well spent. Keep questioning. Keep seeking, keep thinking, and above all, keep living. I'll see you in the next episode. This is Logic over Spirit, signing off.